All right. Well, happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for gathering, for feeling and acting upon our interconnectedness, sharing stories and wisdom and inspiration, especially during these times of isolation and division. It's a potent reminder of the power of humanity as a force for good, for unity, for remembering our true nature as inseparable from each other. So I am really looking forward to this talk today, which is deeply woven with the concept of our interconnectedness and the reciprocal approach we can take to celebrate this. So as plant medicines and psychedelics become more and more known to non-Indigenous communities, there is so much potential for a deeper understanding of our relationship to each other, nature, and all things, but only if we take the time to undo some of the programming that many modern societies promote, which is often an approach of separateness. To me, there is so much we can learn, not just from the medicines themselves, but also from the cultures, communities, and cosmologies surrounding their ceremonial use, and the paths we can find to celebrate and honor the gifts of healing that they've revealed to us. So this is one of many regular events through our new community and integration platform, the Maloka, where we offer workshops, talks, sharing circles, and more from teachers, practitioners, and luminaries across the many fields of holistic health. So this evening, I'm so pleased to introduce Joseph Mays, the Program Director for the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative through the nonprofit Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, where he conducts research and builds connections with small Indigenous communities throughout the Americas to support Chacruna's mission of increasing cultural reciprocity in the psychedelic space. He received his master's in ethnobotany from the University of Kent upon researching responses to globalization by Indigenous Yanesha of central Peru. After graduating with biology and anthropology degrees from Virginia Commonwealth University, he conducted an ethnobotanical survey in the Ecuadorian cloud forest and published a medicinal plant guide for the Hamakawake Ecological Reserve. I hope I said that right. His conservation work emphasizes how cultural conditioning influences approaches to biocultural sustainability. So Soltara Healing Center has been a partner, a community partner of Chacruna Institute since our inception. And if you don't know about Chacruna Institute, I highly recommend checking them out. Chacruna.net. They're an amazing team and platform providing public education and cultural understanding about psychedelic plant medicines and promoting a bridge between the ceremonial use of plant medicines and psychedelic science. And I want to share that as today's event is donation-based, all proceeds will go towards the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. And you can also donate to their cause directly by going to their profile under the organizational partners in the Maloka platform. So we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the talk. And with that, I'll pass it off to Joe. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I think you're the first person that's ever said Hamakawake correctly in that introduction. So congratulations. Thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm calling in from Washington, DC, the Powhatan Nation, or the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is one of the planet's many vital organs. And I just want to thank you all for making time today, and anyone that's watching this in the future. And express my prayer of solidarity, peace with all the people suffering under the violence in Europe, as well as in Yemen and Syria and Somalia and Gaza and the Amazon, the indigenous peoples in the Americas and around the world. One of the reasons that we're here is and the reason that I created this reciprocity initiative is to confront those cultural and economic kind of roots of the crises that join all of these different conflicts together, and it really relates to the sense of reality and relationship that we have. So thank you again to Soltara and Melissa and Sylvia and everyone that's supporting this event and this talk. I'm really grateful to be here. So this talk is kind of based around the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas that is a program of the Chacruna Institute, but it's also kind of, for me, it's the focal point of where my path has brought me in my work and in my art and my life in general. I've been doing ecological and ethnographic work for over a decade, and this photo that you see here is a picture I took when I was first in the rainforest 8 years ago, and it's in Ecuador, where I used to work at an ecological reserve, and that, you know, that was early on, but that's when I had my first experiences with ayahuasca, and I think that those experiences are still working in me today, and I think are part of why I'm here. And you know, over the years, I've been working on this pursuit of conservation, and I've come to see that biological and cultural conservation are inextricably linked. So it's in that spirit that I helped create this initiative, and it's kind of behind what I'm going to be talking about. So, like Melissa said, I'm the program director for this program called Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. We call it IRI for short. So IRI is a resource that connects people directly with grassroots Indigenous organizations, and the goal is to promote community-led projects that address food security, environmental health, land rights issues, economic and educational support, reforestation, especially in agroforestry. And the thread that connects all of these projects is that they're all self-determined by local people. So they're all designed and implemented by Indigenous communities to meet their own needs and priorities rather than something imposed from the outside. And I think a lot of this stems from an exploration of how cultural conditioning really, the form of religious or cosmological concepts and beliefs that we all hold about reality itself, whether you're religious or not. This is what we call it ontology, and this is what underlies a lot of things that are supposedly secular or objective approaches to the environment, for example, and these ontological perspectives really influence our attitudes and behaviors in a lot of unconscious ways, and affect the efficacy of our attempts to address ecological crisis. So I want to take a look at non-Western ontologies, especially from the Amazon, that inform a different sense of relationships and then allow for true reciprocity to take place. So I mentioned before, you know, I came into this from the fields of ecology and anthropology, and ecology is it comes from the Greek oikos, which means house or home, and it's the study of relationships. So it's the study of relationships between living organisms. But I think before we can really address ecological crises, understanding those relationships and orienting ourselves is really important. So that means we have to understand the story that we're in, or you know, ethnography is about telling stories. So what story are we all telling about ourselves and that we believe about ourselves? Because that's the story that gives us our orientation and our identity. And you know, one that many of us were given is that we're all separate individual selves born into, you know, a meaningless universe, lifeless particles colliding in deterministic patterns. But it's not really a sustainable story, and it's not even really scientific, even though that's how it's presented. So I want to try to challenge some of those. And during this time, my research into this has brought me into contact with lots of alternatives to that hegemonic kind of point of view. And I interacted with a lot of people like Don Ricardo, who's pictured here. Don Ricardo is an indigenous Yanesha elder. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, just before we launched this initiative, which his community is involved in. And you know, he was one of my close friends during my time in Peru. And he, during my graduate field work, his family really showed me that alternative story that we're invited to enter into, where life is always communicating with us, and our well-being is intimately connected to the well-being of every other human being, of every non-human being, and organism and organ of our planet. So I want to ask, what can we learn from Indigenous stories and stories of relationships that are so different from this story of alienation that's established in the shadow of colonialism, of global capitalism, of modernity? And what is the story or the ontology, the cosmology that we all unconsciously operate under? And I think that's really what determines the nature of all our relationships. And reciprocity, which is what we're here to talk about, is something that only happens within a system of relationships between beings who recognize each other as subjects. So with agency, and how we see others, not only other human beings, but other organisms and trees, forests, fungi, animals, rivers, organic compounds, as well as how those beings perceive us. This is what makes all the difference. So there's a story that had a big influence on me. Comes from an ethnography by Eduardo Cohn called How Forests Think. And this is about his field work in the Ecuadorian Amazon with the Avila Runa. And there was a story about, camping in the forest on a hunting party. And they told him to always sleep face up, because if a were-jaguar happens to come by during the night and sees you looking back at it, then they recognize you as a subject. So a person capable of looking back, and a self like themselves, and then they leave you alone. So for the Runa and many others, how other types of beings see us is important, and it also challenges the division between nature and culture that we're conditioned to accept by dominant forms of thinking or ontologies. So the dominant ontology or story that we're living in, if we're forced to recognize that seeing and representing and knowing and thinking are not exclusive to human beings, it really takes that story apart, that story of colonization and exploitation. So this is another photo from my time in the rainforest, my first time in the rainforest. And it's, I was just always fascinated by like the network of different beings that confront you at every moment there. But it's a reality that's always there wherever you are, not just in the rainforest. It's just really easy to see there. And I think this conversation about stories, it points to the connection between our relationship to nature and the world, and then how that relates to conservation. So I think that we can all agree the perspective shifting value of plant medicines, especially visionary experiences, and the stories and the ontologies that are informed by those experiences, that is something that's a powerful response to this dichotomy between nature and culture that we're familiar with, that treats the environment as a network of subjective selves with agencies. And we're all relating with that network with all of those other beings. So like in that story of the jaguar, there's a view of all living beings as persons or subjects with agency. And this doesn't mean that they're all ascribing human characteristics. They have plant characteristics, they have forest characteristics, they have whatever, but they have a personhood, and they have a consciousness, and they're an intelligence. And that's not something exclusive to humans. That idea is, just like in the Amazon, it's been called Amerindian perspectivism, and this is just this anthropological term, but it really just means like for example, in the Chacruna cosmology, the vulture is seeing the maggots in a rotting carcass the same way that we see a river full of salmon. The peccaries, they see their salt lick as a community feasting hall, and the forest itself is a thinking being that's a network of selves with its own thoughts, with whom we're in constant communication. And I think that sort of Western or global North scientific perspective that reaps the benefits of ethnopharmacological discoveries of plant medicines generated by indigenous people, it also dismisses the indigenous perspective as unscientific. It's a contradiction that is connected to the degradation of forests and communities by those same forces that are profiting from them. And I think leaving behind that dichotomy between nature and culture, and engaging with this other ontology, this other story that views forests as living, thinking networks, and all other beings as subjects with their own minds and agency, is a really psychedelic point of view, and it strengthens indigenous autonomy. It ensures the protection of valuable resources of biocultural diversity, ecological knowledge, and it also allows the seeds of reciprocity to really germinate and take root. So this is another photo of Don Ricardo. This is the first time that I interviewed him. He invited me to his office. This is next to his herb garden, his chili pepper field. And I remember that he brought out some wooden stools that he had built, and we sat down, and he said, this is his designated interview area. And it was like under the shade of some ulcumanos, and like across from some avocado stand where we had harvested avocados from earlier. And he always joked with me like he was going to charge me 100 soles per hour for the interviews and stuff. But in reality, he never asked me for money, and neither did anyone that I was working with, even though, you know, in Lima, everyone said, oh, the Indians will all ask you for money. They're all that way. And at one point, you know, when we were deep in conversation, Ricardo and I were just talking, and then we were interrupted by a chorus of citizen birds, which are like little parrots, in the branches above. And he just immediately paused and pointed it out, and he said, listen to the little parrots. Like, it's not always like this. It's not so common, and it means this is a good moment, because, you know, he said they only sing that way sometimes. You don't see them around. And you know, he's in his 70s, and at his age, he remembers probably when that bird song was more common. And over the decades, he lived through the deforestation of this valley. He lived under religious persecution from Franciscan missionaries, displacement from colonos, from European communities. But he welcomed me with open arms, and you know, he was still harvesting coffee in every day, and working in his garden, and he was always listening and always in communication with the forest, which is speaking to us whether we hear it or not. And you know, he also had a TV where he watched boxing matches, and like he was a really amazing person. So I like to dedicate this to Don Ricardo and Sacho Pen, which is where this scene unfolded. It's an indigenous community in the high forest of central Peru. So it's in the Pasco region, which is in the middle there. And it's, you know, far over the highest reaches of the Andes Mountains, and it's about 7 kilometers from the closest urban center, which is a colonial town called Oxapampa. And it's right along the edge where the foothills meet the Amazon basin. So when I first arrived in this valley, the Chorobamba River Valley, I noticed how the soundscape changed. You know, the revving engines, the honking moto taxis, and the barking dogs, and everything in the city gave way to the bird song, to chirping insects, to the rustling canopy and the tree-covered mountainsides. The leaves themselves grow bigger the further that you go in. The conifers and the lowland species are coming together in this ecological zipper. And it really reminded me of the mixture of worlds that this community represents. The Anesha are from one of the oldest diverging branches of the Arawak language family. So this is where we get hammock and tobacco. This was spoken in Haiti before Columbus invaded, and they've lived in this homeland between the Amazon and the Andes for several thousand years at least. And this is a crossroads between the Inca Empire and the rainforest. They survived the arrivals of Spanish missionaries, of conquistadors, Austro-German colonists, Andean migrants. And in this river valley, the sun rises over the Yanachaga Mountains, which is the really tall mountain range in the back there, and it sets behind the central Andes. And it's really where this community of Setropen, of the Anesha that I spent time with, they navigate the implications of living in a biosphere reserve with a growing tourist presence, the convergence of the local economy and the global economy, the parallel forces of cultural and ecological erosion, and then this demand for a traditional experience, traditional appearance, as well as the local desire to recover foods and customs of their ancestors. And this is a very similar sort of context that a lot of communities are facing in the Amazon and throughout the Americas. And I think it's clear that Ricardo, along with many others, including his son-in-law Eduardo, who's in this picture, they have many medicinal plants in their gardens. They even have nurseries they've started for recovering lost varieties of food. Like they have, in the past, they had 700 different cultivars of manioc or yucca or cassava. Now they have 4. So there's a desire to recover those lost varieties. And Eduardo is leading a traditional dance in this photo. And he also is like a song keeper and tries to reteach the dances and songs. And one of the most popular is about ayahuasca, is about this entheogenic brew. And the lyrics describe a time when the Anesha were all sick and dying, and they had to take ayahuasca in order to transform into a giant snake and be cured. And when they perform it, everyone sings along. Everyone, they'll put it on a demonstration for like the municipal authority or go to the town, or just do it within the community and have other communities invited. And everyone joins in and sings along, even though they don't all know the Yanesha words, but everyone knows the ayahuasca. But it's really, what's really interesting and sad is that everyone sings it, even though in Satropen, where this is taking place, there aren't any shamans or curanderos. There's no ayahuasca tradition. They don't take ayahuasca. I think, I'm not sure what the story behind that is. That's something that would have to be investigated in the future. But Eduardo knows that ayahuasca is attracting tourists and attention in other communities, and he recommended, that I go visit the Matsugenka if I want to take ayahuasca. These are his brothers, and they're in the same language family, our Arawakan language family, and as well as the Ashaninka. And he warned me that you shouldn't take ayahuasca to see visions that will only cause death and madness, that you take it only as a medicine. And the first time I saw Eduardo performing this dance, he was leading everyone wearing his ceremonial dress with feathers and seed and shell bandoliers and tambores and shakers and the achiote face paint. And I remember being like hypnotized. The chanting and the singing and the synchronized dance patterns were pulling me into a trance. And at one point, Eduardo kind of snapped me out of it at the right moment. He clapped his hands together and encouraged everyone to clap. And I remember that grounding and that orienting sensation of bringing my hands together and really transforming from an observer or into a participant. So shifting from this perspective of abstraction and alienation into one of communication and relationship. So I think it's all, everything is kind of framed around this transformation. And this is a photo I'm sure that that you all will recognize, but it's ayahuasca, the plant medicine brewed throughout the Amazon. This is a Quechua word for the Banisteriopsis caapi vine, and then Chacruna is Quechua for the leaf Psychotria viridis. And those two ingredients, of the two most common ingredients, the language itself is a mixture of Quechua, which comes from the Andes, and then the Arawakan language family associated with lowland Amazonian groups. You can find markers of both of those languages in Yanesha. And even though the Yanesha are nominally Christian, this is something that still plays a role in their image of the world, their sense of reality, I think, and their relationships. And I think you can see that in many different Amazonian ontologies or non-Western ontologies. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but don't worry about the jargon. It's just want to reiterate that ontology is a cultural perspective, and it expresses ecological and social and environmental relationships within a society. So it really refers to the world that you inhabit rather than the worldview that you have. So it's something that reflects and transmits cultural values that are often connected to cosmology or religion. And in a secular society, it's just the cultural conditioning or the whatever that dominant view of reality and sense of reality is. There's a friend of Aldous Huxley, Lynn White, who wrote a lot about environmental issues in the early days, and he used to link ontology to environmental crises. And he said that what people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relation to the things around them. So that is by religion. And I think our picture of the world and the feeling and the state of being that it engenders is intimately connected to that human environment relationship that we see and that we feel. And the other kind of term that I want to bring in here is biocultural conservation. So this is just, it's the idea that it's a development in the scientific world that views the relationship between cultural diversity and then biological diversity as one and the same. So if you protect one, you protect the other. You can't separate the two. So this is seen in scientific data. It's seen in the fact that where there's more ethno-linguistic diversity, there's more biological diversity all around the world. And conservation itself is really about the balance of our use of nature and the resources that it provides. So it's not the idea of separating nature from people or human activity. This is, I think, traditionally how people think of conservation, biological conservation, is just like developing a national park or something, pushing people off of the land, and then just kind of cordoning that off as nature. And then where that really breaks down, though, is that indigenous territories actually have more biological diversity. The conservation is better in an indigenous or locally owned and managed forest than it is in a national park or a reserve. I think that this measure of sustainable use of nature, whatever you consider that balance to be, is really, it corresponds to your relational perspective, so your ontology. And there's an anthropologist, Tim Ingold, that he writes about this narrative that unlike the animal in its captivation, which finds itself taken in an environmental embrace as passionate as it is overwhelming, the human being stands before the world and as a domain of things in themselves and has a necessity to take a stance towards it. So I think I like the idea of taking a stance is really what is an extension of the story that you tell. So I love this other quote from Gregory Bateson, where he said that, you know, how a society perceives the world results in the policies and the behaviors and the attitudes that hint at this relationship that he expresses here. And I think the way people think, as he puts it here, is really an extension of their ontology. And one of the ways that this relationship manifests is what we mentioned before, Amerindian perspectivism. So this idea of viewing the world as an ecology of subjective selves, of subjective identities in all of nature. So perspectivist ontologies are recognizing that the world is really made of persons. It's an animistic idea where all living beings are fundamentally like personal subjects that see the world from their own perspective, and they all appear as animals or plants or other organisms. But it's a challenge to that nature culture divide that also is connected to the mind body divide, the subject object divide. Some people call it, Cartesian dualism. It's just this separation between things that are perhaps not, that's an arbitrary separation. It's I think the power of an alternative point of view is really what is meant by decolonizing thought. So this dualism is really convenient for the aims of reductionist science, and the authorities that utilize it. This modern model of the world, it has culminated in a lot of scientific development, but it's also marked by alienation. This is the way that we all feel separated. And this is the power of this alternative point of view of decolonizing thought is what can inform how we move forward. And it's really more pressing and prescient than ever, I think, especially in the Anthropocene or Anthropocene. This is I don't know how many more jargony terms I'm going to throw out. This is one of the last ones, I promise. It's just this idea that humans' effects on the earth can be observed in stratigraphic data. So if you look at the history of modernity, this new kind of thinking that underlies human choices that caused this new geological age or era, it's seen as a consequence of our tendency towards symbolic thought, of our obsession with symbolic thought, and the world of symbols that we've created as increasingly disconnected and alienated from reality. And it's an amplification of a human tendency that we've always had to separate ourselves from the world, but it's really been transformed in recent social and technological developments that are coupled with that form of thinking. And it's also not only being a geological epoch, it's like an epoch of thought. And this is intimately tied to this idea of the metabolic rift, or this social and ecological alienation from the resources by which we survive, and also the natural world that produces them. So when these symbolic worlds override our sensory experience, they threaten to alienate us from reality completely and really cut us off from the world around us. And this is characterized by the dominance of reductionism, of fragmentation, resulting in this alienation from nature that facilitates all of the biocultural destruction that underpins climate change. And it served a function for trying to understand and break down certain things, but it's I think we can see that it's been taken too far, and that we've lost like something along the way. And I think one of the solutions to this problem that social science has suggested is called the ontological turn. And this is this movement within ethnography and anthropology, which is attempting to really center that difference between ontological perspective that we've been talking about. So this is like connected to looking at more than just the human being, the human species in your ethnographic inquiries. So this is like bringing that Amerindian perspectivism, that view of nature as mind, as having a mind, as being a network of selves, bringing that into a scientific approach. So it represents this path toward de-alienation and really breaking that dichotomy, that nature-culture dichotomy. And it, I think, highlights the lessons we can learn from animistic thinking. I think for someone that's educated in Western scientific contexts, it's not like you can just choose to become an animist, but you can be provoked to see how animism is subjectifying. It's like the polar opposite of this objectifying way of reducing things to their functions, of separating things from their context. It provides a possible antidote to that alienation. That's the consequence of transforming relations into things and perceiving life as a collection of detached objects. So going beyond this is something that is reorganizing this arbitrary divide, the subject and the object, or the nature and the culture, and then viewing forests as living and thinking networks, and viewing all of nature as a mind, or mind manifesting. And this is really something that's increasingly being demonstrated by scientific data, by recent studies on trees and plants, which store information, which learn and plan and respond to events around them, that communicate with each other as well as with other species. And it shows that the interpretation and the use of signs that hold meaning are not things exclusive to humans or even to animals. And this is really what maybe was thought of as a psychedelic point of view. It's a psychedelic view of nature, but it can be directly applied to scientific efforts to conserve nature, as well as culture. So, we've seen how we benefit from the medical revolutions that have been based on recipes from Amazonian indigenous groups. So this is a picture of curare arrow or blow dart, and this is a South American arrow poison that revolutionized the understanding of neuromuscular function. This is just one of the many examples, but it was developed into an anesthetic called D-tubocurarine, and it completely changed surgery. It like totally transformed the field of neurology as well as surgery. And pharmaceutical companies have developed lucrative medicines with Amazonian origins for the past 100 years at least, but even before that, during the first rubber boom, and finding quinine as a malaria remedy, which allowed for further exploitation. It includes anti-malarials, antifungal compounds, anti-cancer drugs. This is just, I'll just skip this, but this is just acetylcholine receptors in our muscle cells, which is, acetylcholine is a chemical transmitter that activates nerve impulses. Curare, the arrow poison, blocks it, so it stops the muscle function. And this was a brilliant invention by the indigenous peoples in South America, because it allows you to hunt animals and for example, monkeys that are really high up in the canopy, because if they get hit with a regular arrow, they would just coil around the branch, and then you wouldn't be able to get the meat. And then if they're paralyzed by the arrow poison, it doesn't actually poison the meat. The meat is safe to eat. The poison only affects if it's injected, and it takes like 72 hours to boil these plants together to create this, and it's a toxic concoction that the fumes can kill you and smell really sweet. And it's like just this amazing chemistry that's very dangerous and complicated. But the idea that it was just stumbled upon by trial and error is really not very statistically probable. It's actually much more believable that there was some other form of communication going on. And this is the same story with the ayahuasca brew. So this is this whole concept of turning plants into products. It's much easier to do so if you're alienated from nature, if you're moving entities from their relational context, converting them into objects. In many cases, the companies that profit from these medicines that are poached from indigenous people, this is the first commercially available preparation of curare in this picture. it's something that a lot of people in the psychedelic community are discussing now, but it's been going on for decades and decades. This problem of biopiracy, and actually in 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity was created. This was supposed to develop, was supposed to address these concerns by using like IP law, intellectual property laws, but in most cases, it's completely failed to really protect cultural resources, and it doesn't really always apply to commercializing something like ayahuasca. And it's also just, despite the fact that like 75% of plant-based pharmaceuticals originate with traditional societies, and all of these medicines were developed from an intelligent relationship with nature. It's not, and also the idea of intellectual property is really a colonial concept as well. That's really hard to apply to something like this. And it rests on this idea that trial and error is how these recipes were created. But as I said before, it's not really a satisfactory explanation. And as, for example, with ayahuasca, it's like you have to combine at least these two unrelated plants from out of over 100,000 different species in the Amazon. And then this preparation inhibits endogenous stomach enzymes and allows for the entheogenic effect of dimethyltryptamine. It really stands as a testament to this in-depth botanical knowledge that indigenous practitioners hold, and that underlies the origin of all these complicated preparations. And if you ask them how, if you ask the Ashaninka or the Shipibo shamans, what do they attribute this expertise to? It's to the plants themselves. It's to being in communication with this network and being taught directly through these visions how to bring these plants together, where to find them, and really just the idea that people just stumbled upon the knowledge. It really belies this greater story, and it also functions as an excuse to pirate that knowledge, to mismanage those forest resources, and then also devalue the indigenous knowledge. And this goes beyond medicine and pharmacology. This is also integral to ecological knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge. Like I mentioned before, there's a global correlation between traditional societies and then biodiversity hotspots. So the more there's a huge body of evidence that supports the fact that indigenous territories have more biodiversity than national parks or forest preserves or nature reserves. And the source of this ecological knowledge as well as the medicinal knowledge is these subjective experiences, these visionary experiences that often involve plant medicine, but also just involve this close relationship and this sense of reality, that these empirically effective medicines, these management strategies, medicinal substances that come from this system that depends on visionary plants, on shamans who ingest visionary plants, this kind of counters the mainstream narrative about science. Biomedicine relies on and exploits this objective knowledge, this empirical knowledge of these practitioners, but it doesn't recognize the subjective experiences as a source of objective knowledge. So it's really a cognitive dissonance, and it results from this outdated legacy of modernity that holds that this nature culture divide is something, this mind body divide, this dichotomy is born out in the natural world, but it's really been challenged by even just the emergence of ecology as a field. This is a holistic science, and it studies relationships, but in the Western context, it still reduces plants to isolated chemical compounds or compartmentalized ecosystem services, different populations of organisms. And I think the alternative involves viewing plants and their medicinal properties as in relationship with all other beings. And this living community is revealed through visionary experiences with plant medicine. And it's a source of healing as well as illness. And I think it's you could say that the treatment of plants as subjects this is an ontology shaped by ayahuasca drinking peoples, by this positive effect on biodiversity. It's, I wouldn't want to say that it's always the case. This is really important not to misrepresent Indigenous people as perfect conservationists. This isn't really an invitation for everyone to travel to the Amazon in droves and take ayahuasca as if it will solve all of our problems. And there's a real ethical danger in expecting Indigenous people to provide the solutions to these ecological crises that industrialized nations created, and then bearing the brunt of the consequences at the same time. Ethnobotanical studies have revealed a strong link between cultural and biological diversity, but it's also important not to treat Indigenous people as unchanging monoliths without agency. So in response to globalization, to the pressures of the market, Indigenous societies have always been changing, are still changing. Land is becoming less and less available still. The space that once could hold a diverse polycultural forest garden has to be dedicated to a cash crop like coffee. This is the most important cash crop of a lot of agricultural people, communities, including the Yanesha and Sachopen, where I spent some time a couple years ago. This is Eduardo from before, but this is just showing me his coffee plants. He's really proud of his organic coffee because he feels that it's living as his ancestors did, which is not using industrial fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides, and creating an agricultural system that reflects that sense of reality as a system of relationship. So I just wanted to share this quote from another a Yanesha leader who was in a community neighboring ours, or neighboring Eduardo's. And he says that many criticize us and tell us that as Yanesha, we must not forget our custom and our culture, that we should live in our humble house eating fish and wild animals. But will Yanesha live from that? Our coffee is now our black gold because it is the only one that gives us the economic means to survive. We are in the 21st century, and Yanesha is now able to be an entrepreneur. But this does not mean that we forget our identity. If a brother invites you to take manioc beer, you cannot refuse. You cannot be ashamed because it is part of our culture. So I don't want to oversimplify this view of Indigenous people or reduce nature to this dichotomy of human subject and object, or anthropomorphize this intelligence of forests. This is a different type of thinking that's much more applicable to, I think, ecological crises that we face. This is applied to the biocultural approach to conservation that we talked about. This is a direct correlation between cultural diversity, ethno-linguistic diversity, and biological diversity. So this idea of thinking forests, this kind of psychedelic perspective, it provides a path to follow in this response to these complex issues. And I want to just reiterate that larger community forests, as well as like increased community ownership and autonomy, is what really yields higher carbon storage, higher biodiversity, all of these markers that at least the field of conservation has determined are the metrics to measure well-being in an environment. And these are seen more in Indigenous territories than they are in land that's managed by government or state authorities or NGOs. And I think it points to this idea of forest, of thinking like forest, this kind of decentralized relational point of view, contrasted with our maybe culturally conditioned ideas about the body controlled by the brain, or the nature culture dichotomy. I think I don't want to go too much longer because I want to have time for questions, but I'm just going to wrap up. I have to say though that if thought is representation, then what does it really mean to represent something? So if we're going back to the story of the were-jaguar at the beginning, thought involves creating meaning It's something that's more than just linguistic or symbolic. It's not, we conflate it with representation with language or symbols, but non-human life forms represent the world to themselves and to each other. Plants sense and respond to their surroundings. They're sensitive to gravity and light and touch and hearing even. They store memories, they integrate information. These are all things that we would call thought if there was a nervous system involved. There's even experiments that have shown that Venus flytraps are counting the numbers of times that they're touched, because each touch in sequence determines what it's going to do. So if it's just brushed, it won't close its trap. It has to be touched a specific number of times before it starts to produce digestive enzymes, and then before it starts to send the signal to even close, it has to be another specific number of touches. There's also a experiment recently with flowers that they sense using the petals as sort of a receiver. They're sensitive to the frequency of vibration of their pollinators' wing beats. So when they hear their pollinators near, they start to produce extra nectar so that there's more of a reward for them. And this is triggered by only their pollinators and not just any random insects. So we're seeing that plants are hearing and they're even counting. This is sort of tempting to think of forests and plants as human-like, but this is a different type of intelligence. It's plant intelligence, and this is what we need to learn from to change the way that we're thinking. There's this relational perspective is an ecological one, so it considers existence as a co-productive exercise that rejects this human exceptionalist position, and it instead it recognizes the interconnectivity of existence. So an ontology that allows for thinking forests is an anthropology that goes beyond the human species. It recalibrates how we represent environmental relationships, and it comes with a promise to reorient our ethnobotanical perspectives, our plant medicine perspectives, all of our perspectives across all disciplines. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, I guess. This is like, what is the relevance of this psychedelic idea of the world as minded, or forest as thinking? This is just a picture of my favorite flower, Corianthus. It's a type of orchid, has a really amazing complex relationship with bees and ants. It's like the most fascinating flower. I could talk about it for another hour, but that could be another time. So what's the point of understanding the world differently, or trying to sense into this other way of seeing reality and feeling our relationships to the material world, to science? Science is actually heavily affected by myths and stories that are repeated and they influence research priorities and conservation approaches. This is a religious like sort of authority that many people give to science, but one of my favorite anthropologists, Stephen Rubenstein, he said that reconsidering previous research is also a hallmark of science. So all science rests on the admission that the scientist may be wrong, and that another person using scientific methods can confirm or disprove previous research. So this is kind of a conflict. It could be seen as a conflict between this idea of objectivity versus subjectivity, or relationality versus separation, or an animism versus a reductionism. And I think that these ideas don't have to be mutually exclusive. And this is also seen in a story from the Avila Runa, who we talked about before, like in the jaguar, the were-jaguar story. They have another myth which shows that this ability of like not a lot of non-Western ontologies to capture multiple perspectives. There's a jaguar catching myth, where a man is patching a leaky roof, and he asks his son-in-law to help him find the leaks by standing inside and poking a stick through the holes where you can see it really well from the inside, but from the top on the thatches of branches you can't see the holes. but you can see the stick and you can patch the hole. So this sort of conversation is like is supposed to be like that stick that joins that inner world and the outer world, that aligns that inner perspective of non-human intelligence of thinking for us, and then the outer symbolic or human perspective. And I think the interconnectedness of the natural world is really reflected in this merging of social, ecological, and political realms, and all in the pursuit of conservation. It's apparent that political and ecological problems are one and the same. And so focusing on relationship is called for to really encapsulate the full picture and also de-alienate that environmental approach. So focusing on ecologies and relationships, treating conservation as holistic, interdisciplinary, it reframes and it bridges these seemingly disparate processes. And I think something informed by visionary experiences, like an ontology that really underpins a perspective on conservation, prioritizing relationships, so prioritizing ecological relationships, making plant knowledge inseparable from people, where a plant's healing power comes from its relational context in a living network. This ontology is a structure that all of our environmental relationships rest upon, and studying that really gives us critical insight, and it really regrounds our relationship with the natural world, that makes all of our lives possible, and really provides a vital refocalization on the way that changing relationship is shaping our futures and ourselves. And I think this is a perspective that's hinted at by visionary plants. It's applied to biocultural conservation, and it can liberate us from our own mental enclosures. It can be a way for us to attend to the work of others, to what lies beyond ourselves or our own minds, as well as our own species, and also create a different ontology that helps us understand how we can live better in a world that we're all sharing with other kinds of lives. So this is what I had in mind when I helped to create this initiative, the ERIE, and it's a pathway for supporting Indigenous communities, and it's a resource. It's meant to be accessible to all people, to business owners, investors, as well as just anyone that's felt the benefit of plant medicines in their lives from any walk of life. It works as a pool of funds of 20 different grassroots Indigenous organizations. They're all community-led organizations and initiatives, and they do everything from protecting water resources to building plant nurseries to reforest with native foods and medicines. And these species are voted on by community assembly. There's community mapping to try and get more support for their legal battles for land tenure, as well as replenish native sources of medicinal and traditional plants. And I think conservation that's done in this biocultural way, it recognizes that the greater biodiversity and carbon storage and lower rates of deforestation is all found in Indigenous territories, that it's based on relationship. And ERIE itself, the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, is based on relationships of trust that have been built over many years. It's a ground up structure, so the funding is unconditional. There are no strings attached to the support. That's what's meant by decolonized philanthropy, and it includes Indigenous communities that aren't already known to the psychedelic community. They don't necessarily use those same psychedelic plants that often have been focused on, and it's really, the focus is on increasing Indigenous autonomy. So other models of support are often based on short-term projects, unsustainable or disempowering relationships imposed by outside authorities. The projects are often funded by the EU or the UN or an NGO. And it also is coupled with this kind of romanticization of Indigenous communities. But the reality is that these these communities are impoverished and suffering and more likely not to have access to clean water, to basic resources than any other demographic in the world. And then at the same time, all of this wealth is being generated from this psychedelic tourism. And the same impoverished communities that are subjected to like drug tourism are, still in this same position. And despite all of this, they still harbor 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. So I think this can never be said enough, but the legacy of displacement that Indigenous communities face is ongoing, and the access to land and resources is continually being depleted. Deforestation is continuing to rise. Even during the pandemic, when people were celebrating the reduction in carbon emissions, deforestation was going to record highs. So it's in many cases, the mainstreaming of psychedelics is not necessarily helping. It's in some cases exacerbating this imbalance. And I think despite how bleak it can seem, this is really an opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for change. And it's an invitation to try and right that imbalance that we see. So that's what really reciprocity means, is a commitment to righting imbalance. So this Quechua word aini that you may have heard before, translated as reciprocity, it doesn't really mean just a give and take exchange. And especially in this context, the taking has been going on for centuries. So it's the giving is what's important for us in this context. And reciprocity can only happen within that system of relationships. And those those need to be recognized in all contexts, between employer and employee, between the global north and the global south, that traditionally profits from unequal exchange, from cheap labor and raw materials from the global south, between the individual and the community, between you and the society of beings, non-human and human, that are all part of this biosphere that sustains us. So to create this ethic of reciprocity for everyone, individuals, practitioners, and then, really find a way to live and honor the realizations that visionary experiences have given us of interconnectivity, the realization that all of life is relationship. I think life is a gift that can never really be fully repaid. So you're already born in debt to that gift. And so giving is like, for me, is serving or just focusing on other communities. This is one way to really like make reciprocity an action that you have to constantly perform every day of your life. So that's, I think, where I'm going to leave it for now. Just wanted to say that last year we raised almost $100,000 for Indigenous communities after just 8 months, without imposing agendas, without creating conditions or strings. And these are funds that can be used to immediately address the needs of these communities. And each initiative has its own structures of accountability. They have their own community structures, and they all are able to freely share updates on their projects, and it's viewed as a partnership where they're empowered. And there are so many stories I could tell about the work that's been affected by this, and it's still going and it's still growing. And it's something that you can keep connected to by following our updates on social media, but we also are still producing article videos and sharing every week about the different communities that we support and our partners. And I think that, yeah, it's just my humble attempt at finding the most impactful and effective way to honor these relationships. So to try and embody reciprocity in everything that we do. So I hope that we still have some time for questions, and that's it for the slides. So thank you so much again to everyone here.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was an absolutely amazing, inspiring talk. And, you know, I really, it paints a really clear picture of, you know, I think where the stories that we're telling ourselves in these sort of this global North society, these more westernized societies. And what I find really interesting is the way that the ecological and relational lens science is also starting to come back around to this. I mean, you know, we'll include the books that you shared when we send out the follow-up email about this, because I think it's a really cool opportunity to see these two worldviews merging. It seems like it is happening, and there's some deep wisdom and truth we can learn, both from the experiential understanding and perspective that's gained from plant medicines, and then also understanding the worldviews and structures of some of the cultures that have been in this great communication with plants for thousands and thousands of years. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really beautiful offering. And if anyone has any questions, you can either just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask them, or pop it into the chat. I'll start off with one question. What do you see? What's your vision for the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative? What do you hope for in the next, let's say, this year? Where do you see it going, and how can we support?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you so much for your kind words. I think, you know, my vision would be for no need for an ERI or a reciprocity initiative. You know, I think that it's right now serving an important function as being this sort of Chacruna is kind of taking on the role of dealing with the world of philanthropy, of bureaucracy, of these conditional relationships that you have to form in order to fund this work, and then allowing for the communities that we support to just do the work that they're already engaged in and have the support that they need, the material support, without conditions. And so I want it to be sustainable and to be a network that's self-sustaining. So eventually I wouldn't have a job anymore, and I would be happy with that. And I think I've always envisioned it as more than just a fund, a pool of funds or a resource, but also a network that's organic and living, and that can be used for solidarity and support between the communities involved, rather than just from Chacruna and from the people that donate. I want to be able to always explore other ways that we can be of support. And sometimes that means like producing videos or articles, traveling and speaking and spending time with communities on their projects, but that all involves funding and special conditions, and it's that's not the goal necessarily, but I think it's all part of the vision for what ERI can be a platform for, and also just for education as well, and just like reaching a wider audience with this message, because I think it kind of weaves together a lot of these different issues and related concerns and movements together and into one place. So
Beautiful. I love that. I love the idea of also building the relational networks between the different communities, between, you know, donors and organizations and the communities themselves, and then also continuing to share education and travel down yourself and build those relationships. I think that's really, really beautiful. Anyone has any questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Well, if we're waiting for someone to raise their hand or ask a question, I just want to say, like, you know, the community that I spent time with for my graduate field work. This is the Yanesha in Sacho-Pen. This is like the start of Erie. And that was now 3 years ago. And one of the sort of concerns of researchers a lot more often now, thankfully, is how they're going to support and give back to the communities where they traveled or did their field work. In the past, that often means like just giving a copy of your dissertation to the community translated, or passing along something from your life and career beyond. But many anthropologists and ethnographers, Kat Harrison and Catherine Allen, and many people that spent their lives working with these communities, then the rest of their life becomes an act of service of just trying to stay connected and stay supportive and find ways to support those communities. And so this is kind of what that grew out of, and it supports 20 organizations and 38 different Indigenous groups. So it's been an organic sort of process.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I love that continued evolution of this type of work, and it makes sense based on what it is that you're actually diving into and the way that it can kind of grow and form from that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. Ashante says, thank you for this presentation. I do food justice research, and a lot of the themes you mentioned are familiar to me. It's great to hear it from another perspective. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Ashante. It's definitely all related, isn't it? Well, I will say that Soltara and the Maloka are very happy and honored to be community partners of Chacruna, to support this initiative however we can, continue to donate and share and educate about it. I think there's lots of juicy tidbits from this talk we're going to be sharing with our community. So yeah, again, thank you so much, Joe, for just such an amazing talk. And I'm so grateful for everything you're doing to support the movement, to support this work, to support these communities, and also for generously offering your time tonight to help us connect to this amazing work that you're doing. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. Yeah, absolutely.
And Ashante, thank you for your comment. I think food justice, food security, it's all definitely related to what we talked about in these perspectives, but also I think it's also part of our tendency to just like group certain compounds in plants and say these are the ones that are psychoactive or psychedelic. That's not really what the truth is. All food is medicine, and all of these plants are psychedelic in their own ways, and the relationship that you build is what makes it that way. And I think you can have that with the whole spectrum of plants around you, not just the ones that lead to visionary experiences directly. So
yeah.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Soltara and Sylvia and everyone that invited me, and everyone that was here today and listened. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just want to share before we close out that the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative and Chacruna Institute are both listed as organizational partners inside the Maloka. So you can visit the networks tab and click on organizational partners. You can see their profiles, read more about their approach, the work that Joe's up to, check out their website. And if you feel called, if this talk resonated, if you've benefited from plant medicine or just really connect with what was shared today, please do consider donating to the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative. Any amount helps. Share with your networks as well. And if you appreciated this event, we'll have many more for the public, as well as members only events and discounts for those who sign up for the Maloka Inner Circle membership. You can check more about that under the memberships tab. And just to finally share that our next event is going to be a really fascinating workshop with storyteller Eric Godsey called The Bonfire, Alchemizing Exile, on March 9th at noon. So go into the events tab on themaloka.com for more information. So thank you so much again, Joe. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we sign off?
I'll go ahead and plug my Instagram. This is where you can connect with me. Feel free to message me at Chieflow, CHIEFLOW. Would love to talk more if anyone didn't get a chance to answer a question, or if you're watching this in the future. And thank you again so much. Just have so much gratitude for this community and the community that you created. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe. We'll send out the recording if anyone missed the beginning, and those books and Joe's contact info. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you.